it was so weird. And I just booked you guys to come on. And then she sent me a message. She was like, oh, you should really get Glitch to come and do a talk. And I was like, hey, we're like totally on the same wavelength. Like, yes, they're already coming in. Yeah, so she's really familiar with you guys and your work. She'd probably be better to do this, but alas, I'm recording them all. So I have to lump you for today. Okay, so are you happy to get started?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, cool. Welcome to the next episode of the Social Media Union podcast. We have a really interesting guest with me today. And whilst it's a topic I'm not sure that any of us would go, oh my God, this is so exciting, I can't wait. It is something that we really, really need to know about. And actually, once you dig into it, is so fascinating, so interesting, and so relevant for us, for any of us that work in social media. So I hope you're all well. Settle in and have a listen. So today we are talking about the online safety bill. And I have my wonderful guest here with me today to talk us through it. So please introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Jenna. So my name is Caitlin McCullough, and I am the head of communications and public fundraising at a small charity called Glitch. We were set up to challenge and combat online abuse with a particular focus on the experiences of Black women, with an understanding that if we make the online space safer for Black women, it will be a safer space for all of us.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And what we'll do is just get straight into questions because we've got a lot to go through today. And obviously it's a really big, meaty topic. So first up is can you just give us a brief rundown of, which I appreciate is tough because it's, like I said, it's pretty meaty, of what the online safety bill is all about?
Absolutely. So I'm going to caveat this with the fact that I'm the head of communications rather than the head of our extraordinary advocacy team. So I've got a good understanding of this, but if I get any of it wrong, write in, let us know. So the online safety bill was a product of a Conservative manifesto promise a good while ago to make the UK the safest place in the world. And it's been in the work for about 5 years now, so as long as Glitch has existed, and will be the first legislation of its kind in the UK, looking at kind of creating some parameters around the online space. So the current focus of the bill is on search platforms like Google, Bing, that kind of thing, and user-to-user platforms such as social networks. And then they have some additional considerations around children's safety that kind of override those categorizations. One of the core proposals of the bill is that Ofcom will become a regulator of these kinds of internet services. So the tech companies will be reporting to Ofcom about the work that they're doing to prevent or to limit online harms. In that long time period, the bill's been through a few different versions already. The first was more of a systemic approach, so a focus on risk assessment, transparency, and risk mitigation. And that's looking at duties of care for tech companies, but that has more recently been merged with a content approach. So that's where they specify particular harmful content to respond to, essentially creating a list of offences that can be linked with criminal law. So at Glitch, that's something that we don't think allows for kind of future proofing when technology is such a fast moving pace, as you all know, working in social media and having to keep on top of it all. So a fixed list of content types to address rather than a wider based risk-based approach and a systemic approach, we feel will lead to gaps and a failure to protect against new uses of technology. So the current bill has some of that risk assessment built in, but it's largely those lists of offences, and it categorises that content into 3 spaces. So there's criminal content, and that's where all services are obliged to act because a crime has been committed. Children's safety duty, which is focused on content that's harmful to children and applied to services that are likely to be accessed by children. I think there's still some work to be done around definition of what is accessed by children. And there's a heavy focus on children in the online safety bill, and harmful to adults, which is often referred to in our sector as legal but harmful. There's ongoing conversations about what should fit under the criminal content category when they're creating this new law, but also what's considered legal but harmful. That conversation is being pushed currently to secondary legislation, so there's no clear time frame around that, but it could cover a huge range of damaging behaviours online, and we think it would be really beneficial to have a clearer idea of what they're considering the scope is within that legal but harmful range. So in terms of what the bill might change, the hope would be for greater accountability from these major platforms and safer spaces online, and a concrete definition of what can be shared on user-to-user sites legally. But there's definitely a lot of questions and concerns around the bill, how it will be enforced, whether the proposed approaches are effective ones. And when it comes to Glitch's approach to the online safety bill, our core message that we hope will eventually come through with this bill is that online abuse is abuse, just as offline or in-person abuse is. You know, it's real, it has a real impact. We talk about like in the real world and then like online as though they're separate things, but we're still like people experiencing that, whether it's through a screen or in person. We would say that tech companies have been unregulated for too long. They've allowed that abuse to spread in the name of profit generation. And in that time, we've only seen online abuse increasing, even with policies set by those platforms. So we're hoping that improved legislation and improved regulation would mean that they would have to be more accountable and more transparent. And then when we're looking at that abuse, seeing Black women as being at disproportionate harm and yet not being protected through the bill, which I'm sure we'll chat about in a bit more detail later in terms of our focus with Glitch and this legislation.
I don't even know where to start because it's so big, and I like was just almost didn't even recognize that you paused there because I was just like totally trying to take it all in. And I think like I have definitely been guilty of a little of just not quite understand, not taking the time to like fully understand this online safety bill. And I think having worked in the industry so long, and you were saying just before we hit record that you worked in social media as long as I have, like, which is too long probably, but and so, you know, people like you and I are totally aware of the issues, and I think the fact that they are addressing them is a really great idea, and I have the same concerns about how that's done, I guess, and how it's going to be monitored. Do you know, the thing I'm thinking of in my head is when Mark Zuckerberg was invited to the US Senate to speak, the last one, and the senators asking the questions. I know like everyone, it kind of went round our world at that time, had no grasp of what they were talking about. Yeah. And it just frightens me so much that these are the people who have absolutely no grasp and were using words that are correct, but in totally the wrong, in the wrong way, are the ones making these laws and putting together this legislation. I appreciate that's the US and not the UK, but does Glitch have the same concerns about those that are putting this legislation together?
I think there's definitely concerns about whether the legislation is informed by the lived reality of people using the online space. And while organizations like ours and others are invited to kind of provide evidence, ultimately this legislation is being written by, I'd imagine, some people that don't have that deep knowledge and understanding of the social platforms. And it's partly why we have things like our advocacy team to lobby MPs and to speak to change makers and say, well, we have this knowledge, so let us help you write something that's actually meaningful. Let us help you create something that's going to make the online space safer. But I would say, I just wanted to reflect on what you were saying before about that feeling of I should know more about this, and it's, you know, it's in my profession, I should be aware of it. I mean, this bill, it's taken a long time to get to this point. It's 225 pages long. It's a really huge document, and it's written in essentially in legalese. It's quite dense to get through. So I really wouldn't beat yourself up about not knowing the ins and outs of it. I think that part of the purpose of organizations like ours is to try and make this information accessible, and to pull out what's working and pull out what's not, and to try and make those changes while there's still time. Certainly to my mind, and one of the things that we are pushing for from Glitch is an understanding that online abuse disproportionately affects people from marginalized communities, but they're not being named in this bill at all. So if we're thinking about whether the people making this law have an understanding of what they need to change, at the moment, they're not naming one of the most prevalent issues. They're not talking about racism, they're not talking about sexism, they're not talking about a rise in kind of right-wing rhetoric on these platforms. If that's not being named in this legislation, then how is that being adequately addressed? And is it not being named because they're not experiencing it themselves? If this is mostly being written by white men or people with particular kinds of privilege, and they're not listening to the experts in this space, then inevitably that legislation isn't going to be relevant.
So up next, what areas do you think those who work in social media need to know, and how it affects them in their work? So getting down to kind of the specificity of our industry.
Absolutely. So I think it's important to say that the bill is going to take a long time to go through Parliament. It's going to go through various different stages. There's going to be amendments from politicians. There'll be amendments from the House of Lords. So we can't have like that concrete an idea just yet of what it's going to look like in practice. How it will look in reality is not going to be clear for a good while. But it is likely that the larger platforms will begin preparing for the bill in the interim. They will be closely like monitoring what's going on, what's being proposed. In terms of our understanding at the moment of what the impact would be on people working in social media, there's a few things. The legal but harmful content that we were talking about before, that is likely to be quite key to any moderation practices that you're doing. So when that is developed, when there are clearer guidelines and lists around what content is harmful that needs to be removed, that will be really key for social media managers to have an eye on, and like to have an understanding of what's been identified. Obviously some content will be criminalized in this bill, and that will be a new thing. So something that previously might have been allowed to kind of sit on your platform before will be made illegal under this bill. So while it's really unlikely that your listeners are posting, threats of physical violence or sharing like non-consensual graphic images, it is really worth knowing that like content will have legal consequences, and being mindful of that when you're regulating your own spaces and kind of empowering yourself to know what content you can act on in different ways. I know that sometimes that feeds into a concern around freedom of speech being impacted by the bill. Our understanding at the moment is that there shouldn't be any additional concerns about freedom of speech beyond anything you have with existing legislation. So it might be that you don't agree with the laws we currently have, but the bill is leaning on existing offline laws to create laws for the online space. So it's about kind of extending existing legislation, as far as I'm aware. If you run your own platform, so you've got your own user-to-user social media network, then the bill as it currently stands is focused on the size of platform rather than the scale of the harm or the risk, which is actually something that we'd quite like to be changed, because we think that small platforms can also cause a huge amount of damage. But currently the focus is on those big beasts. So unless you're running Meta or Twitter or one of the big ones, it's unlikely that your actual business will be in the scope of the bill. But importantly, if you're receiving abusive content, those big companies should, in theory, respond more swiftly if they're being held accountable by a regulator. I don't know, we'll see. We'll see how that plays out in practice. But I think that the belief is that with that regulation, there will hopefully be more protections for you to kind of keep your spaces safer online for your members. What I would say in terms of thinking about, what the online safety bill is going to mean for you is to recognize that like this is a bill to address when abuse is happening, but it's not necessarily going to end online abuse. So it's really important to kind of ask yourself what your role is in that as an individual. Do you want to wait 2 more years for this legislation to be created and then follow like the letter of the law? Or do you want to reflect on your role as a social media manager or as someone working in the social media space, on how you'll be a good digital citizen, how you will stand up for others, and how you will lead by example? And that's something that we really strongly advocate for at Glitch. It's like we've all got a part to play, whatever community we're a part of, and being aware of the impacts of abuse, and particularly the impacts of abuse on Black women, will improve the work that you do and will help you to create safer spaces for your members.
So thank you so much for sharing that. I think we're definitely going to have to do another podcast at some point with because you were mentioning like Glitch does workshops, and I think actually doing perhaps some kind of variation on that for our members would be really cool. And I think something I know definitely the majority of them, if not all, would find that really helpful, like the really practical advice. Because one thing we want to do with SMU is really educate all of ourselves, even those of us that have been doing it a really long time or are like really quite senior, is how to protect those within our community. And that's a huge, one of our clients over the years that's been a huge problem for us, is protecting those people within our community that we've created and that we manage. And any kind of advice, especially as these platforms progress and become more complicated, it's about knowing what we can and can't do, what we feel comfortable with, what kind of oversteps the mark. And most of us have like a pretty good idea of what that is. But I think not all of us do. And especially for those who are newer to this industry, being able to give them advice that, comes from gut instinct from working in this space for a really, really long time. But I think you're not going to have that if you haven't been in this for, 5, 10, nearly 15 years, whatever. Can you tell us about Glitch's work and also the campaign that you have that's specifically around the online safety bill?
Absolutely. I'll start with the online safety bill, as that's where we've been kind of focused so far.
Cool.
So our advocacy team is campaigning for the online safety bill to, at a minimum, name women and girls in the legislation. So in all 225 pages of the legislation, if you control an F, you will not find the woman, girl, sexism. Those words are not mentioned at all in the entire piece of legislation. So we're not just saying that they're not fully understanding the scope of gender-based violence online. We're saying they are not naming it at all. And if you don't name the issue, how do you possibly begin to address it? So in collaboration with the End Violence Against Women and Girls Coalition, we have a petition. You can find it online. It's linked on our website, calling for the government to actively name women and girls in their legislation. I think particularly when there's such a focus on children in the legislation, there's huge chunks of writing about the impacts on children, and at no point is there a recognition that the impacts on girls might be different to the impacts on boys. Not saying that there's necessarily a hierarchy, but that naming those differences can be really fundamental. We would say that online abuse is a gendered issue, and one that needs to be addressed with an intersectional understanding of abuse, like we chatted about before, that a Black woman's experience online might be different to a Black trans woman's experience or a Black disabled woman. So looking at the different ways that our identities intersect and how that can result in heightened abuse. If we're not naming that in legislation, then we're not doing enough. So you can sign that petition. That's something we're doing. We're also working with MPs and other change makers to make recommendations for the bill. We've got a full briefing on our website that will give you much better information than I can. But largely we're concerned by the focus on content rather than wider systems, the desire to list specific crimes rather than establishing what the overarching risk is, and how that's not very future-proofed. And we're concerned about the heavy focus on criminalisation and the dismissal of non-criminal behaviour despite the harm that can be caused. We're calling for a more holistic approach that brings in education and safety by design. So education around media literacy, just bringing that into every stage of our lives, but particularly into the school spaces, and safety by design, believing that it's possible to create user-to-user systems that are built to be safe rather than you having to go back in and build in safety afterwards. And we want to do that rather than endorsing a punitive approach that's so heavily focused on criminalisation, incarceration. And then we also want tech companies to pay fairly for the damage that's being done in their spaces. So we're calling for a tech tax, which follows something called the polluter principle, whereby companies that have enabled a societal harm like pollution or like online abuse should pay to help rectify the damage that they've caused. So one of the things that we're advocating to be included in the online safety bill is this tax on big tech companies, and for that funding to then be ring-fenced for organisations that are combating gender-based violence and abuse, particularly with a focus on the by and for sector. So organisations run by Black women for Black women, or by survivors for survivors, that kind of thing. But as you know, our work isn't just the online safety bill. Even our advocacy work isn't just the online safety bill, though it's easy to get a bit focused on the one thing. We also do other kind of lobbying and engagement. We've been looking at the AI Act that's being brought in the EU, and the like wider global implications of legislation that's being proposed around the world, because the online world is somewhat without borders in some ways, so it's very useful for us to know what's happening globally. We run workshops. Occasionally we have ones that are funded for us to deliver for free, so you can keep an eye on our social medias to find out when those are running. But we also deliver training and workshops to businesses and organizations all around how to be a good digital citizen, how to be an online active bystander, so to step in and support someone that's experiencing abuse, and how to keep yourself safer online. A lot of the work we've done with that has been built around supporting women in public life, disproportionately women who have been elected to be like local councillors or MPs, cite online abuse as a reason for leaving that space. So we're trying to kind of create those toolkits and that advice to help people make the online space a bit safer and have a bit more control over their experience online. So I'd imagine that that those workshops would potentially be quite useful for a lot of your members. We do awareness raising work. We try and engage with the media and try and bring this conversation into the kind of wider social vernacular. And we do consultancy to support businesses and organizations to improve their internal work around online abuse, how they're protecting their staff, and also how they're building that safety by design into their new models. We also on our website have lots of different resources. So we have a database that you can use if you're recording abuse that you've been experiencing as an individual or as an organization, and advice on how to use that effectively and in an empowering way, and also resources around being an online active bystander. So that could be quite a good place to start in terms of learning more about what we do, why we do it, and how you can be a part of it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. And the last question I've got, we've touched upon this in the last one, but just to ask it directly. So there's some really like kind of clear calls to actions from our listeners, for our listeners, I should say, not from our listeners. What can our members and listeners do to support Glitch in its work?
Absolutely. So join our community, be part of this movement for change. You can do that by signing our petition and engaging with our advocacy work. You can attend our workshops. You can encourage your workplace to commission us for training, so that you can embed that understanding of online abuse across your whole workplace. You can donate to us as an individual or as a business through our website. And you can follow us, engage with our community on Twitter and Instagram. We're at glitchuk_. And those are the two main platforms that we use. We have a newsletter called The Download. I really recommend signing up to. It's a monthly kind of primer on what's going on in the online world. So 1 month it will be an interview with an expert. Another month it will be a piece of more detailed, maybe like an explanation of the online safety bill or what's going on with AI in Europe. And then we always share a bit of a list of links that we've been finding useful as well. And then be part of the solution by being good digital citizens yourselves. Engage with the online world, recognize that it's your responsibility as much as it is everybody else's. Don't displace it, see it as part of your job, and we'll make the world better online and offline as a result.
Awesome. It feels so well aligned with what we're trying to do with SMU, and that's just all of us just trying to make our corners of the internet just that little bit better and make social media that little bit better. And I can from time to time be quite embarrassed to say that I work in social media, and actually with that feeling is one of the reasons I started it at SMU in the first place. It's like, what's the point of me changing careers? I should actually, why don't I try and make it better, like a little bit? And I feel like especially our listeners will be so up for getting behind Glitch. And so what I'll make sure I do to everyone listening is I will share the links when we publish the podcast, when that goes out. So everything that you need to know will be up on there, and how you can help and where you can donate to. I'll make sure all of that is shared with you guys. So the last question I have for you today, a little bit more lighthearted than the online safety bill, is just what's your favorite account to follow on social and why?
I have a slightly cheeky answer to this, which is our
Oh, good.
CEO, Shay Yakiwowo.
Great.
Partly because we're
Great.
missing her, because she is on a 3-month sabbatical at the moment. We really value like self-care and well-being at the organization. So she's taken 3 months out to rest and recover. But also because she has a book coming out about online safety abuse that she is really engaging and dynamic and fun to listen to on Instagram and on Twitter. So she's at Shay Yakiwowo, which again, I can send you the link for the spelling for that. But she's also part of a community on Twitter of Black founders and leaders. So she's a great place to start if you're wanting to broaden your understanding of conversations around racism and online abuse, and just more inclusion in the online space generally. So she's my main recommendation, if I can get the words out. But I'd also just say follow voices in communities outside of your own, and use the internet as a space to learn and find joy and pleasure. It's very easy at Glitch for us to get bogged down in the bad things about the internet, but we're really driven by the fact that it's a joyful place and it can be a place of learning. So seek that out, and I'm sure it will make your online experience better.
Yeah, and I think probably at once every couple of months, like go through everyone that I'm following and just go, nope, gone, and just have a general principle myself. Like if anything makes me feel bad about myself on Instagram, just unfollow straight, and like absolutely immediately, and just trying to curate this a more positive experience for myself on social, because I know how much it can affect my mental health if I don't do that. I am also going to suggest someone today, and that's Gina Martin, the activist, so pretty well known out there. She put through the bill on upskirting. That was pretty much down to her, and I just really enjoy following her for also her incredible advice on how you can get involved in activism and be an activist yourself, but also her dog is adorable, and she also does this thing called Vitamin P on a Friday, which I genuinely look forward to every single week. And like if she's late with it and she'll apologize to that, I'm like, oh my god, no. Like I have to wait till the next day. It's just like 30 really nice videos from TikTok that just really make me laugh. And again, it's that just reminding, as kind of like joyful as it is, it's just that reminder that the internet can actually be quite a nice place to be sometimes. So I really recommend that you follow her. She's great as well at signposting other activists and causes that we can get behind, that are really important too.
Definitely second that.
Yeah, she's great. I'm really enjoying that, her work. So that's it for today. Caitlin, thank you so much for taking the time to explain this. As I said, I will share all of the links so everyone has all that information. And yeah, we'd love to have you back on again in the future to kind of take us through some. I really like the idea of, the being a good digital citizen. So we'll see what we can work on with that. Amazing. Okay, and thank you so much to everyone listening today. You have made it through about the online safety bill. I hope that Caitlin has, and she certainly has for me, made what could be, a whopping great big topic really digestible. And I genuinely feel like I understand it more, so I hope you feel the same. Don't forget, we have the Discord forum. So if you have any questions about today, if you have any thoughts, then be sure to head over there and, get involved in the community, and talk to us all about those and propose those questions. And that's it for today. And look out for the next podcast coming soon.